with my worst fears becoming disturbingly real. I listened to a few explorers and they pointed in the general direction of a possible solution. Seeing as there was no trust with New London anymore, steel was the primary focus of the military warehouse, and the workshops developed, well, they were developing stronger heaters for the cold that was approaching. Cold that would make it incredibly unsafe to work in the military warehouse, or indeed anywhere that didn't have a brazier. There was currently more wood than we knew what to do with, but I would be a fool to believe it would always remain so. Because there was nowhere for a wall drill. Perhaps there was another source of wood as well. Well, that was for another time. The primary concern was where to find a more reliable food source. And also, would there be enough steel to improve the housing by the time there was another decrease in temperature? Well, at least the workplaces would be safe enough to work with. Next was better transportation across the wastes. The terrace had a view and there were signs of life in a secluded valley. That was worth looking into, as we had very little, if anything, to lose by this point. Most of the houses were... well, most of the tents were in the process of being converted into bunkhouses. Which would mean that they would be better protected from, well, what was coming. Yes, all of the houses all of the bunkhouses would be ready before the temperature decreased. And the workplaces would be safe enough to work in. If the current leader of New London was in my position, I expect that he was being far more reckless. And it'd be likely that I'd have him replaced with one that was actually capable. He could almost be accused of... well, the food had arrived, what little there was of it. And the observatory ruins were looked into. I was starting to suspect that even before the frost, there was a village missing its idiot. And that was him. Unfortunately, that it would imply that this was a thoughtless action. When it was far from thoughtless. The problem with having a vendetta against someone with unorthodox views unorthodox views that resulted in no one dying because of the frost. At least none that could be avoided. Is that he'd likely drag everyone else with him. And I hoped that wasn't the case. Because it meant that he'd put himself over everyone else. I wouldn't be surprised if he hoarded some of the food for himself, so that he'd be the last to die when New London collapsed under his rule. There was a settlement beyond the secluded valley. The hot springs. At this time, it was Outpost 11's last hope. Where there was warmth, plant growth was possible. And some plants were edible. The heaters were needed, even though they would increase the amount of coal used. I could only hope that there was enough of a surplus.
Hurry up, people! We have a quota to fill!
The food situation was growing ever more desperate. So it was at least worth investigating these hot springs. As many were starting to believe that anything was better than what we had at the time. A more efficient coal mine, or rather, the method of gathering coal, was considered necessary. Would that be enough? I suspected not. But it was a worthwhile improvement to make. problem with New London was, like many before, the cold spread across the world, is that they wanted more for less. Not considering the possibility that it would only be a matter of time before that less became too little. And if they complain, well, they should have thought about that before they mistreated all of us here. As for what to work on next, well, nothing with heating, nothing with exploration that hadn't already been developed, so something to make it easier for those working in the military warehouse. Not to mention quicker. I knew that a sawmill would need to be made closer to the trees at some point within the next couple of days, because I had this feeling that wood would be needed all the more. And not just for research purposes. One of the scouts was nearing the location, the hot springs. They were indeed our salvation. They had a surplus of food, some of which they could share. Well, spare would be a better word. They mentioned that they needed help themselves. They would certainly get it. They would prove to be more reliable allies than New London. The food would need to be transported to New London, and transported quickly. A trading outpost would need to be built there. And this is something that New London would fear most of all. Because the main reason why they had such a tight grip on power was because they had sole control of the food supply. And food was a problem. Because there was so little of it. In fact, there was none by this point. Although by the time the trading outpost was built, or rather would be built, and the food from hot springs arrived, that would become less of a problem. At the end of that work shift, the military warehouse worker's job became easier. Although a coal thumper was needed to offset the lack of coal. It would also need an additional... well, it would need a gathering post to gather all that coal. Food situation was growing ever more. Oh, you get the idea. They just needed to hang on a little more. Because food was on its way. Unlike New London with Outpost 11, we would not treat hot springs the same way. We would earn their trust. with a more reliable food source found. The people's worries were lessening. Although I knew that New London would not lose grip on power. Not without a fight, anyway. It would depend on what their reaction would be.